Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to do a follow-up video to another video I had just done explaining that big exercises should generally be done with very low reps, usually skewed in the direction of heavy weights. Conversely, very small exercises, and examples of ones that I personally do, would be maybe tricep movements, right? Tricep exercises like the JM press or face pulls, or glute ham raise crunches, or hyperextensions, right? These are exercises that I do very large amounts of volume on personally. And yours might be different, right? Yours might be a different muscle group. It might be a lateral raise. It might be band pull aparts. It could be a lot of different things. There's different things people can do that are going to be obviously much smaller exercises. So when I say that we need to do heavy weight and low reps for the bigger exercises, a lot of these smaller exercises lend themselves better to not only very high volumes of training. We don't need to worry as much about things like junk volume. We don't need to worry about things like programming to the same extent. And that's something that's come up a lot. A lot of people say, well, I just see people do endless amounts of face pulls with no programming or plan for progressive overload. And you know what? Here's what I would say. That's perfectly fine, because you're dealing with very small exercises that are using relatively lightweight, in which you are just adding additional training volume. And we could use the face pull as a perfect example. Perfect example, even though it's a multi-joint exercise, it's a small exercise. Is that all you're usually doing for your rear delts, biceps, traps, to some extent even lats, rhomboids, all that stuff, rotator cuffs? No, it's a secondary exercise. And accordingly, it's just adding additional fatigue to those areas. And what we're doing by adding that additional fatigue, we're trying to induce hypertrophy. We're trying to induce hypertrophy, and hypertrophy is a product of training volume. It's a product of total workload done. And yes, we can throw very large amounts of what would be, in many cases, be considered junk volume at little small movements like that. And as long as they're movements that don't create tendon problems, the junk volume isn't a problem. We're not going to overtrain from it. We're probably not going to get overuse injuries from it. Now, conversely, could a preacher curl fall in that category? The biceps are being used in it just like that? No, because something like a preacher curl puts a large amount of stress on the lower insertions in your bicep where they insert in the forearm. It's a relatively unnatural movement pattern. So that can create tendinitis, that can create connective tissue inflammation. So the same rule wouldn't apply to something like that, but it could for certain types of curls, right? And it certainly applies to something like a face pull. Same thing, we go to tricep exercises and discuss the same thing. Skull crushers or press downs where you keep your elbows stuck tight to your side. Or a skull crusher where you bring the bar down to just your face. In some cases, and for a lot of people, can create a lot of inflammation in the lower insertions of the triceps, in which case that exercise, if done with ultra high volumes of jump volumes, could contribute to overuse. It could contribute to tendinitis. But movement patterns that are a little more natural of a movement pattern, and it could be anything from, like I do, hyperextensions to sit-ups on my glute ham device, to face pulls, even JM presses, right? Different exercises that are much smaller in nature that don't cause inflammation with large amounts of use, and that's going to be very movement specific, and in some cases individual specific. We're not worried about junk volume because we're not going to overtrain from it. We're not going to overtrain from it, and therefore we're not worried about junk volume. In fact, we're not even worried about programming, because let's say you're consistent. Let's just throw out there randomly that you do 15 to 20 sets of face pulls every week with the same bands like I do. If you already have progressive overload on most of the big muscles involved, you're just adding extra volume there. Your progressive overload is already coming in the form of your pull-ups or chin-ups or rows or whatever your primary exercises that you're programming are, right? That's where a lot of times your new training stimulus is coming from. All right, those muscles are going to be in a somewhat fatigued state by the time you get to those 15 to 20 sets of face pulls you do every week anyways. And therefore, all we're doing is creating additional fatigue. We're creating metabolic fatigue and metabolic stress in those muscles. This just additional workload that we're not worried about causing overtraining in terms of junk volume or recovery issues. Therefore, we're not as concerned about type programming. We're not even always concerned about progressive overload. If you want progressive overload, add an extra set or an extra rep here or there, right? Instead of doing 20, see if you can get 21 on some of the sets, or just take them all the way out to failure. And if it's not causing a recovery issue, it's not a big deal on some of these smaller exercises. And yes, we can throw large amounts of little junk volume. We don't have to worry about optimal rest times. We don't have to worry about periodization. We don't have to worry about these things because we're not worried about recovery. And we're not worried about progressive overload on the small exercises that are not going to create recovery issues for smaller muscles. And as long as it's not interfering with our big lifts, we can just always add more volume on them. And so what's the point of exercises like this? To hypertrophy weak links, to hypertrophy support musculature. And I would go so far as to say that a lot of these, because bigger muscles recover much slower and have more problems with recovery, so we have to limit the amount of times we train a big exercise every week and the amount of volume. We don't necessarily need to worry about that with more support muscles like abdominals or our rear delts and things like that. So we can do face pulls and crunches and things like that. We can do them every single day. We can do 3-4 sets of 20 every day if we want. In fact, I routinely do stuff like that. Me personally, I train my lower back almost every day with hyperextensions, and I do sets of 20. I do abs every day. Sets of 15 to 20 all the time. Sets of 20 to 25 on band face pulls, right? Things that we do day in, day out. What about some of the smaller lifts like my JM presses? I mean, I do an enormous amount of pressing. I have 2 pressing days every week. I have a max effort day and then I have a dynamic effort. My dynamic effort, I do sometimes 20 plus total sets of normal presses between speed benching, overhead pressing, or push presses, things like that. And then I do JM presses at the end of both of them, 5 or 6 sets. But because it's a smaller exercise, and it's a smaller exercise, it doesn't seem to interfere with my personal performance and recovery on the big lifts. I can throw in 10 to 12 sets of that little small exercise every week. And it's fine. And it's fine to do that on these. As long as you're recovering from them, you can use junk volume on these small lifts. And this is the difference between when we talk about big lifts and our general size and strength versus the little small finesse exercises, or some people would even call them bodybuilder movements. As long as we're selective in them and we're not picking them randomly and then picking ones that are going to cause inflammation, such as the wrong sort of skull crusher or a preacher curl or something like that, or in some cases, if you're not careful, leg extensions, right, we're not going to have problems. Now, we can run into issues with these on some hamstring exercises. You can't throw endless amounts of glute ham raises at your hamstrings. It won't work. In fact, sometimes you can't even do them at the end of your other training. That'll interfere. But a hyperextension doesn't seem to. So when we're dealing with these little more nuanced exercises that don't have recovery problems, we can just keep throwing volume. We can just do volume with minimal thoughts for programming, minimal thoughts for progressive overload. And it seems to oftentimes fly in the face of what we talk about with the bigger lifts or even secondary lifts. And a lot of people say, well, you're going against what you normally say. Yeah, I'm going against what I normally say on the big exercises. Because we have to be dogmatic in our programming on big exercises. We have to think in terms of effective volume, junk volume, recovery, progressive overload programming. We have to, because those are the exercises that give us the most gains, but they're also the most limited in that regard. These smaller exercises aren't. They're not, and we don't have the same problems with them. And they can add, over time, they can really add a lot to your big list, because if we can do large amounts of ab work and lower back work and rear delt work and things like that, and just using that as examples, or even tricep work, it will give us either more strength on primary or secondary movers or support musculature for our big lifts that will allow us to improve their performance without interfering dramatically with our recovery. Well, that becomes valuable. And again, because of the nature of these smaller lifts and the fact that they're oftentimes not always interfering, if done correctly, with the other movements, it just doesn't matter. We don't have to be as strict about these things with them. And they can, over time, put a lot of extra muscle in just the right places of where you want it. Or, again, support musculature in such a way that will allow you to safely improve your big lifts with lower chances of injury, with better form because you have better stability and stabilizer muscles that will allow you to gain more size and strength over time. So again, we're dealing with almost polar opposites in terms of what we can do with them. And these are the exercises that we need to do high reps with because they're less injury prone for it and they're not a problem in terms of junk volume the same way that a squat or a bench press or any other big lift is. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.